Unfortunately, what was predicted, recess had been no different for Lincoln. He stood there around like he was in a trance, while his friends played at the tetherball. They asked him to join, but the lad kindly declined. Not wanting to pressure the boy, they left him to his thoughts, while keeping an eye on him in case if he wandered off. During the previous days of recess, Lincoln could at least make some effort to play tetherball, since the only sport required one hand. Being outside was so allowed to himself to relax as Lincoln gave an all good around view that one should view his sister's approach out of nowhere. Speaking of which, his mind was still stuck down on what happened at lunch. It wasn't so much that Lynn's very persistence had troubled him. Well, sort of it was. It was how she did it. Whenever Lincoln thinks of the sporty loud, she was either boastful, egoistic, tossing things at him without warning, dragging him into doing whatever sport she wanted, and whatever words you could come up with, phenomenon of rude. Today, Lincoln might say, was a cross between Lenny, Lucy, and a bit of Lori. She was fairly quiet and nice, a little persistent, but was acting more like her age than she had previously, not counting the hospital visits. Interestingly, Lincoln noted that Lynn seemed to avoid talking to him entirely. The short glances she gave him made Lincoln to think that she was considering it, but ultimately kept the conversation among with his friends and her eyes. Lincoln blinked, for a feeling couple stray tears starting gently down, flowing away from the corners of his sockets. For the first time, it felt like an eternity. A fair amount of brotherly instinct developed in his chest. A moment when he gazed at those pearly whites, he felt the pain as Lynn was expressing. But at the same time, he couldn't be too certain. Lynn was predictable, but Lincoln knew that she could often catch him off guard, even on the best of days. These new thoughts were added onto a laundry pile of other things running around in Lincoln's mind. The sister fight protocol, past incidents where he ticked off his sisters, the being of itself, Lincoln's friends who were still willing to protect him, his dreams, his therapy sessions, and now this. The loud boy flinched as he squinted his eyes shut as the school bell's ringing echoed throughout the yard, incidentally causing him a migraine. He put his hand to his head not noticing Clyde coming up behind him. "Lincoln, come on, we got classes to do." "Back into the dungeon, yay," Rusty moaned, dragging his feet on the grass as he made his way towards the doors. Clyde raised an eyebrow, watching Lincoln scratch his head. "Okay, I know I asked before, but are you sure you're okay? You've been quiet since lunch, and I'm assuming you got a headache." "How could you tell?" Lincoln spoke up with an eye glance at him. Clyde gave him an unamused look. "You always put your hand to your head whenever you're starting to get one." He then grabbed Lincoln on the arm before pulling him into the building. "So, what's really on your mind?" "Well, everything," Lincoln groaned. "I'm not so sure about things I used to, like my dreams were a big adventure that might lead to something in now." The boy paused as he and Clyde separated for a few seconds after going through the doors. "I know my sisters will usually act when things don't seem to go their way, and I was certain that they were up to something no good when it involves me. But at the same time," Lincoln breathed through his nose, "it feels like I don't know anything." "Well, you didn't freak out upon seeing Lynn," Clyde responded. "That's because I was more confused than afraid, and I'm pretty sure I would have ran out to the nearest door if it wasn't the case." "I'm still surprised that you didn't." Clyde stopped at his locker and began fiddling with the lock. "If you're having a third time trying to get your brain together, you could always call Dr. Lopez. Works for me every time." The nerdy kid put his combination in and undid the lock, grabbing a few books. Lincoln raised an eyebrow. "But I didn't make the appointment last time we talked." "So call her office. Keep in mind she doesn't like it if you phone her too often." "Not too surprised that from Clyde," Lincoln sighed inwardly. In spite of the advice time, wasn't as something he had right now. The late bell would ring at any moment, but unfortunately Lincoln didn't need many materials for his next class. Art was one of those subjects where his freedom of expression was something the teacher tended to take seriously, and much of the work was done typically drawing freestyle or in a certain way of grade. Books were only needed if a class was to go over historical figures like Picasso. Upon walking in, Lincoln saw the desks pushed up against the wall with canvases, filling what would have been empty space. The lad smiled a little. The teacher usually had these put out when he wanted the class to spend some time on their own particular styles. Lincoln usually got A's in this class since he would be so creative at his work, a fact that he didn't particularly notice or care for until recently. He was grateful that Lynn didn't break his right arm, lest his drawings would look equivalent from a 4-year-old making stick figures. Honestly, he ever tried writing hand you don't normally use? It feels awkward and heck, you can barely read what you made. Not everyone was born with the gift of being ambidextrous. It was so certain the days of the week where Lincoln shared his class with another close friend of his. Ronnie Anne came out of the closet, brows knitting and tongue out as she fiddled with the apron of strings behind her. Spotting Lincoln setting up the canvas next to hers. "Hey, Lamo, mind helping me with this?" Lincoln glanced behind him before giving a small nod. Ronnie Anne turned and kneeled down, fiddling with the laces until he tied them both into a bow. This was the system they had in class. Lincoln would help because Ronnie Anne always had a hard time with the apron. Lincoln would use his tie effectively for obvious reasons. In many cases, it would look awkward for the both of them, especially since Lincoln could only use one hand freely and needed to be closer than usual to Ronaldo just to tie the strings effectively. However, he can only still use the fingers of his lefty to hold the laces, while the right did most of the work. The first time Ronnie Anne asked him to do it, a few students decided it was a good idea to send a few teases on their way. The entire class spent the whole period cleaning the room, and as painted became splattered all over the walls in the ensuing fight. "And done!" Lincoln stood up, shaking his legs to get the blood flowing in them again. "Thanks, now hold still." Ronnie Anne then took another apron out in the front of the pocket, putting the open one over Lincoln's head, before he turned so she could tie him down. "So, how was lunch? Heard from the guys that Lynn was there." Lincoln flinched a little at the mention. His head throbbed slightly, but he chose to ignore it. "It was surprisingly okay." The Hispanic girl raised a brow. "You sure?" She then pulled the laces a bit, her tone becoming more authoritative. "You don't sound like it went well." No, it was fine. Lynn didn't try anything, even though I wanted to get out of here as soon as I could." Lincoln felt his body jerk back a little as Ronnie Anne pulled the laces again before she released him. She looked different. Her hair was down, baggy clothing, and when I thought back to how Luann was acting last Thursday and... The boy went silent for a moment, staring at the emptiness of the canvas. "I really should call Ms. Lopez when I can." Before Ronnie Anne could press further, Mr. Sculpture walked in. "All right, class, smocks on." He then waited for a few seconds to let the students get their stuff ready. "Now, as you may notice, there are no paint products placed in your canvases. For those of you who remember what happened last week," the man glared at a few students, including Ronnie Anne, "it's obvious I can't trust you at all to use what little paint we have, that what they're intended for. But I'm all fair, I'll still allow you to use the canvases, with the stencil." Half of the class groaned, knowing that it wasn't fun drawing on the canvas paper without a paintbrush. Some even had issues using a stencil out of tendency. Pressed too hard onto the sheet could cause a small hole. The other half found it suitable, seeing as it was easier to correct a mistake should the wrong color be used. "Now grab those stencils and let your minds wander. Art is about creativity, and I want to see those pictures or scenarios you could take from those brains to etch them into a masterpiece." Over-exaggerated as it might have been, the students were set to work. occasionally making the time their small talk as they drew. The next half hour was filled with the sound of stencils, scratching canvases, and footsteps of the teacher, walking around to check on their progress that mixed well with the ideal chatter. For Lincoln, he found this simple task, but impossible. His mind was too scattered to think of one specific scene or picture, and the fact that he hadn't forgotten over his headache, making him more antsy as he spotted the teacher mirroring his and Ronnie Anne's position. Glancing at his friend, Lincoln could tell Ronnie Anne was in sync of her work. Her hand was moving in various places, along with the sheet that was sketched into her image of reality. That mind thought crossed to him to ask her for help, but it was something that he had chosen to produce on his own. He'd have to think quickly, cause Mr. Skulchner was only a couple steps away. No one likes getting a 0 for an easy assignment, unless you were one of those people who couldn't care less and just take it anyway, you bums. Given an awkward groan, Lincoln pinched the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes shut. If this headache wanted to stick around, he might as well pick something from his raging thoughts to use as an assignment. The debates from earlier knocked to the frontal lobe, each one fighting for Lincoln's attention. After a few moments, a savvy dream camp won out and dominated his thoughts, while the unexpected, unusual from the night terrors, Lincoln had adored them before. The boy had to admit that they were a nice break from waking up, then having cold, covered in sweat and wet pants. Thinking of his sister's personas, his friends' identities, and how were they supposed to solve this impending meeting with between the full house and their ragtag group left room for any self-doubt or worries. Instead, this opened an intriguing question. How would people with varying powers and abilities match up to a full scale to fight? Some had advantages that could be quite handsomely against one person, while at the same time shutting down or to be rendered useless by other characters. As he took stock of his sister's and friend's powers, Lincoln grabbed a stencil and let his hand go to work on the paper. High Card was on the match of skilled fighter as Ace was, being troublesome for the Wrangler and even Mirage and Jack. However, Mirage could easily have the advantage if he had managed to High Card into lowering her guard and making her an easy target for a follow-up attack of another ally. The teen could also be easily countered by Ace Assassin due to her weapon range as well. Deuce and Mad Bomber, who would just sit back and keep lobbing the grenades at her. 11 of Hearts was possibly even no match for the Wrangler, since both of their weapons had some form of rope. Whoever would win that engagement depended on whoever was tied up first. However, 11 wasn't too bright, which would allow Mirage to easily distract her. Ace Assassin would just shoot her through the fabric, of course, and the two bombers once again rain explosives on her with near impunity. Then there was a nightclub. She undoubtedly be a hard counter to bombers, as her wicked sounds could disable the explosive perimeters with the projectiles, and usually their own weapons are useless if she were to use the amp. If the musician had space, she would produce the sounds that could disable most of the team. Should they be groped together? However, there was a chance to take her out if the regular can take her instrument away, allowing Ace, as well as even Jack, to deal with her swiftly. An active bonus, counting that gun ammunition was already supersonic when fired. Ace Assassin could just shoot her amp pieces as well as her guitar if needed. His mind panned to Joker. Lincoln figured that she was about to us such as the wild card as Mirage, proving an even match. This also made her opponent made sure that to use caution for anyone else on Ace's stream, unless they were able to spot her tracks early, disabling her own movement to be best. A field wrangler excels at it. Ace already dealt with her once, and she seemed to rely mostly on her prank devices than anything else, in which some included the explosives, she rarely used. Perhaps Deuce would be a harder encounter for her. The stink bombs could easily disable the prankster like her. Next was on the list was Strawn's suit. Given her straightforward in nature toughness, she'd be a pain to deal with hand to hand, as she was so good for her counter with Ace and Jack. Mirage wouldn't flat out stand a chance if he was rushed in before something could be up. While the regular could possibly hog-tie her, she'd break out of the ropes eventually. Her ability to evade permanent immobilization came in handy a few times when she did get captured after all. The strong-armed girl, known as a decent matchup for the Ace Assassin, was the most bullet-resistant member of the Full House, aside from the Queen of Diamonds, due to having hardened skin. However, Ace Assassin promised to bring her something to break Strawn's suit's defenses, so it was a 50-50 toss-up of who would win. The two bombers were also good as long as they keep out of punching distance. 8 Spades would be tricky, but as she can knack for avoiding conflict, picking off the key opponents from the shadows. Mad Bomber and Deuce would be in a world of trouble if they didn't watch themselves around her. Then there was a little what could deceive her when it came to illusions. Making Mirage a poor choice, Ace Assassin would also have to be wary of using her weapons, as 8 could deflect shots that thick shovels around her. Such as Ace and Jack would be better suited since they needed to lure her out and avoid potential pits she might have dug. Wrangler would also be hard to counter her, seeing as he could just drag her out into the open. With a royal flush, Lincoln paused and drawing to his fink. She was really good with plumbing and could throw off the movement of anyone of her team if she was allowed to flood an area. Such an act would make Ace's group easy pickings for the rest of the Full House. The water was also filled with gas from Deuce's explosives, making her hard to counter the RPG user. She wasn't half bad hand-to-hand either. One hit from that wrench will send you into the maker. However, if the others would best in her combat, the plumber would go down, not only around her that, turning in her own attack against her, but Royal Flush could alternatively dig into the ground to find a suitable pipe to burst. She was honestly a real head-scratcher. Lincoln knew Lana had some kind of mechanical knowledge to how frequent she works with the beaten down and the ride from the family called Zavan, but she was stuck with plumbing skills for the time being. Maybe she expresses that fact later on. Lincoln gave a little shrug before being absorbed into his work again, now shifting his thoughts to the Queen of Diamonds. Given her ability to create diamond shards and filling them up accurately, she is definitely more dangerous when at range and could possibly be the most lethal outside of the two bombers on Ace's team. That isn't to say that she wouldn't be a close match to the bombers as, while she didn't need to aim at them as much, the Queen could pick them off like a sniper. She could also cut up Wrangler's ropes and robs him of main weapon. However, when matched against Ace Assassin, it was a close match or about even. Ace Assassin would shoot Queen's shards out of her air and possibly risk running out of ammo. In an attempt to outgun her, not only that, Queen needs to focus on making her shards, something that she'd be unable to do if Ace Assassin managed to land a good shot. But as mentioned before, Queen of Diamonds was the best bullet-resistant member of the team. She couldn't project a diamond shield that was capable of deflecting projectiles. Sometimes back at the users or at others, this shield was also protected her from small explosives. If they didn't go through off of her feet, the crown Queen wears, also infamously used as a melee weapon, easily tearing through the fabric and skin. However, this was proven to be the last time she fought with Ace. Said crown is what helps her focus on her projections. If it were to break, her power would be held, and it would all come down to who would be the land of the first shot and best each other in a brawl. As for the others in Ace's group, they'd have to take cover or use something to protect themselves against the oncoming shards. When the fighting is in close, they'd have to be extremely wary if the Queen decided to use a shard-like knife. Lastly was card counter. being the brains of the operation, and the main reason Ace lost the fight against his sisters. She would try to limit her exposure in combat and coordinate with Full House's movements. Finding her may be tricky, but most likely they'd be in the spot where she can look at the battlefield. Powerful from a distance, but even then Lincoln had to admit that CC wasn't a close combatant. Sure, she could pick off the weakened components, but against the strong advisory? Her best bet would be to gather the outsmart them or call them in aid of a teammate. However, this didn't mean CC wouldn't have any means of temporarily incapacitate her opponents. Any fights with the little genius should be used as a caution, as there was no telling what kind of gadgets she'd have in her pockets. Ronnie Anne glanced over from her sketch to check on Lincoln's, only to gawk at the details of the characters and the overall scene he was drawing. "Geez, Lincoln, I didn't think you'd go all out." Lincoln flinched as his concentration was broken, making a small hash mark drew away from one character. "Huh?" Ronnie Anne raised an eyebrow as the characters looked familiar. "Aren't these your sisters?" She pointed out at a couple of the dull one with their stencil. Looking back at his own drawing, Lincoln could hardly believe what's placed in front of him of his own doing. While it wasn't exactly professional, it looked as if it was done by someone who had practiced drawing for about a year. The scene she depicted exactly what was playing out in his head. A fight between the Full House and Aces group. Each member of the Full House was engaged in combat with at least one advisory, sometimes two sisters fighting the same person. Based on the positions of everyone else's places, it sort of looked like a cloud fight, but with all the smoke and dirt to obscure it. Yeah, they are," Lincoln replied, staring down at the stencil he held. Mr. Scholar popped up behind him, giving Works a glance. It seems like someone's actually trying for once." "Nice job, Lincoln," he spoke before moving to check on the rest of the class. Ronnie Anne looked between her drawing and Lincoln's, and a small frown unknowingly shaped. "Suddenly, I feel that this is pointless." She then finally put her stencil on the rack below the paper. "What do you mean?" Lincoln asked, looking at what his friend drew a relatively simple drawing of herself, her mom, and her brother. Not bad, even though the body dimensions were a bit off and the faces look a bit plain. The fact you suddenly decide to reveal that you're a pro artist," Ronalda folded her arms, giving a small pouty face. "I'm not really an artist. I didn't even know how to draw that much." "Really?" Ronalda turned her heated gaze to him before pointing at the drawing. "'Cause you can't sit there and say, when I got proof standing right." The tomboy boy, who happens to pause, and now her focus on two particular characters. "Hold on." She traced a finger down to the heroine, holding the gun, taking aim of what appears to be another heroine, wearing sports-themed card suit. "Is that me?" Lincoln felt his cheeks heating up as he focused on what she was pointing at. "Yeah, and Rusty and Liam, Zach and Clyde." Ronalda then looked at the picture, spying their aforementioned friends as well, identifying the rest of Lincoln's sisters. One looked a bit familiar, but she wasn't in the place of the name. "Okay, so to start from scratch," she then looked back at the boy. "How did you end up drawing something like this?" Lincoln tapped his foot in an attempt to dispel the awkwardness of the building within. "I have been having crazy dreams lately." "You mean the nightmares that you've told us before?" "Not really. I stopped having those after I fell asleep reading Ace Savvy one night." Ronnie Anne gave a hideout look. "Looks corny and sounds cheeky. But the dreams I've been having since then are some big adventure I'm going through. I fall asleep for a bit, trying to remember what happened before, and finally it hits me in the face. It's like I'm looking at two different worlds, but I have noticed that they're almost the same." The tomboy raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Lincoln bit his lip. "Most of my sisters still beat me up badly when the first time it happened." It wasn't surprising to the Hispanic girl, but she didn't say anything. Then I started recruiting you guys to help me deal with my sisters, or at least try to find out why they betrayed me and Lily. So that's who it is. Ronaldo glanced back at the drawing. She looks much older, though. She's 7 in there. I already told Clyde about it, and he said I should talk with Ms. Lopez about it more. The loud glanced at the door of the room, especially after lunch. Well, I think you should follow his advice. The tomboy lightly prodded his forehead, getting him to focus back to her. You got a lot going on that noggin of yours, Loud, and you'll need to figure out how to get it fixed. I mean, I'll beat them up for you any day of the week, but no one wants to see you screaming like a girl all the time. Lincoln curled his lips earthward at the sight teased. Despite it being true, he looked like the drawing of himself in Ace Savvy's uniform, who was currently fighting high card alongside with One-Eyed Jack. His heart began to sink, and the differences between himself and his dream personas made themselves present again. Sometimes I wish I was still in this all a dream. At least then, I wouldn't be weak and scared all the time. Or I could just wake up. The tomboy gave a frown of her own. No one said you were weak, Lincoln. Scared like crazy? Yeah, but you're not weak. She would have added the slightest negative undertone to it, but again decided against it, as it would make better for her own advice to void. What makes you say otherwise? Last week you nearly wet yourself after thinking you heard one of your sisters. Not to mention you acted like a harvester was after you. Now you must sit down with Lynn, and you just sat with her and didn't run away. So I say you're starting to act like how you ever dream yourself to be, even though you don't think you are. Ronaldo glanced at the drawing again, spotting Lincoln's personifying against Lori. Captain Undies, she giggled. The heat returned to Lincoln's cheeks as he furrowed his brows. It's part of the costume. All superheroes wear them. Then why is mine wearing shorts? Ronaldo tapped her character on the paper. Lincoln opened his mouth and lifted a finger as he was about to point out the obvious fact, but didn't think of a good reason as to what he thought about it more. The rest of his friend's sons, Clyde, didn't have that would appear to be undies exposed on their costumes, but himself and Clyde were following a set design. It might also be the reason that he laughed by his siblings during the time he cosplayed as Ace Savvy at the convention at the mall. The boy had closed his mouth, lowered his finger, and mind focused on that one incident. Another about depression started to converse through him. Lincoln couldn't even remember how he imagined to clog the toilet. Alongside having to do with the book, he easily recalled getting grounded for it, missing the convention and waited several months for one thing. But getting roasted for his choice of costume for a whole week was definitely another. Back then, Lincoln told himself that sometimes one needed to have thick skin. Unfortunately, he didn't seem to originally have thought. Maybe it wouldn't have been an issue had the teasing lasted only for a few hours, but the constant wearing of his defenses over periods of days finally ruptured the wall that would have kept the results out. Hey Lincoln, let me borrow your cape. These dishes aren't going to dry themselves, Lynn told him once. Are you going to start wearing your undies outside every day? Lana asked innocently. So everyone could think of those nasty skid marks. Ew. Lori replied as she happened to overhear the question. Guess you could say Linky wants the things long and drawn out. Luann laughed at her own joke, and for once a few of the girls laughed with her and Lincoln. To this day they never understood the context of it, alongside with having to do with his undies. Wait, I thought the comic book guys were supposed to have a lot of muscle. Or is it just a costume? Lenny spoke with wonder. What muscle? You could practically see the bones in his arms, Lynn replied with a response to that. Hopefully you'll be able to be wise in the future and pick more ideal costume for a suit for your age, Lisa stated, her usual conceding tone. I don't know if you're supposed to hide your identity with that thing. That hair makes it obvious it's you, Lola spoke in a snarky tone. Those were just some remarks that his sisters had made him the day after the convention. Lincoln didn't wear the costume since the convention outing was canceled on his end. But the jokes of teasing kept coming like a flood, remains after it pours. If the insults were about how ridiculous the costume was, the girls picked a few scrawny. Lincoln appeared to be compared to the hero he was cosplaying. Not that Lincoln cared that much about his strength, but seeing as he could physically separate his twins without too much trouble, but the constant ribbing and several drills were slowly digging into his pride. All those drills dug deeper in receiving a few jabs and a few hit too close to home, such as attacking his hobbies and his other interests. Lori did say they made fun of him for the rest of his life after all. As the week went on, Lincoln himself's self-esteem dropped considerably, and he started experiencing bouts of depression going into day 6. The girls must have pretty much caught on to this, as the very next day they had dropped the teasingly entirely. Lincoln did remember their apology as they fought a couple of their handled jabs, but the damage was already done. Lincoln doubted he'd ever want to wear that costume again, thinking the others might mock him for the same reasons. It also brought up concerns that he might have lost his masculinity due to hanging around his sisters too much. Let's just say the camping trip he had with Clyde wasn't as fun as it should have been. Ronnie Anne watched as Lincoln stared into space, raising a brow in confusion before noticing how glassy his eyes were becoming. "He's doing it again," the tomboy sighed awkwardly. Thankfully, she knew how to get this off of his mind whenever the depression thoughts were stuck in his head again. "Hey," she whispered, poking his nose slightly. "So, what kind of powers did you give me?" Upon seeing Lincoln come back to focus, the girl's lips curled up into a sincere smile. You'll, Lincoln then blinked once, letting a stray tear hang down in the corner of his eye before prompting him to wipe it off. "Nothing too complicated, but I'm sure you'll like it," he smiled back. Lori lazily scrolled through her phone's internet browser, not giving a crap of whatever government topic her teacher had drowned about. She wished it wasn't a requirement to graduate, but her social political classes were easily the worst subject in history of learning. At least the actual history class were a lot more than spouting out whatever ideal practices on the left or wrong wing of the government thought it would be best to run the country. Law by this law that goes jump off a cliff with the politics crap. I just want to live my life as I see fit, and moments like this, Lori could care less about the rest of the U.S. is doing. The happenings of Royal Woods was only her focus, and more importantly, the utter train wreck of her family was in. Aside from trying to ease her boredom, Lori constantly checked her text to see if Lynn gave any updates as to what happened. A pointless indicator, since her phone would automatically beep whenever a new message replied. The couple glances at the time meant Lynn would have talked with Lincoln by now. Each time that passed filled Lori with a sense of dread, thinking of the plan either backfired and made Lincoln crawl back into hiding, or Lynn got hit in the face with a tray again. Probably both, because if it did work, Lynn would have said something by now. Right at that moment, Lori's phone buzzed with a message bubble appearing at the top left corner. Wiping her thumb down, the blonde was disappointed to see it wasn't her sister, but an unknown number. "Are you doing okay? Unknown." Lori knitted her brows quickly before typing back. "Who is this? And how did you get my number?" "Oh, darn it, look behind you." Unknown. Lori stubbornly turned around, seeing nothing but seniors, as bored as she was. She was about to face ahead, promptly blocked the number before Lori spotted movement near the back seat of the row next to her. A small hand was waving to her, to which Lori followed, and she was met with the familiar face staring back at her. The blonde hair made Lori think it might have been Whitney, but Whitney's hair was always curly. The girl seemed to have a mix of eyes, eyeing with the purple blouse. It didn't take Lori much figure to out who it was. Glancing back at her phone, the loud thumbed out a response. "What do you want, Carol?" Lori. "Just want to see if you're doing okay. I mean, I know hardly anyone talks to you these days, but I wanted to be the first." Carol. There had to be more to it, 'cause the two blondes barely looked at each other, even before this whole shitstorm with her family started. Part of it was of jealousy on Lori's part due to her largely one-sided rivalry for Carol. She was much too busy with her own affairs to care. Although Carol did avoid Lori once the rumors were spread about what she did to one of her younger siblings. It wasn't out of hate, she was more concerned about her own safety, given the fact that Lori wasn't fond of her. I am very certain you know that very reason why no one bothers looking at me. Lori. Yeah, but it's been like a little over 4 weeks, and you're still upset? Carol. Why would you care? Do you have some SG meeting to worry about? Lori. There was a pause between texts as Carol got a message from her boyfriend. She knitted her brows a little, as well as she loved the guy. Now it wasn't a time to be planning her next date. You do know one of my responsibilities as class president is to make sure everyone in our grade is doing well, right? Carol. Lori huffed at the message while reading it. So why do you care now? Why do you seem to think much of it before when I've had my boyfriend break up with me? Most of my friends are not talking to me. Everyone else thinks I'm some kind of monster, or having someone defaced my locker. Lori. Carol frowned as a wave of guilt washed over her. She knew very well that she could have done something to stop all the hate and aim towards the loud, but she just sat back and watched and never said. It was safe for her own appearance, although Carol supposed Lori was still taking it like given the circumstances. She was about to give up her own reply when Lori sent her another message. But hey, I get it. I deserved it. Because me and my sister put our bro in the hospital over something that was really stupid in the first place. Even now, he's still healing from what we did to him that day. Lori. Lori, whatever you did to your brother, it can't be that bad. He's still here, is he? Carol asked. No, he's been out for nearly 2 weeks. Lori. Okay, and look, I know I could have did something before, and I didn't. I know you and me aren't exactly friendly in the most sensical term, and I started to believe what others were saying about what you did when you didn't try to stop anyone. Carol. At least she's aware of it, Lori muttered to herself. But the reason I didn't do anything wasn't because I didn't like you. I thought being near you would push you to the edge and you'd do something to get suspended. Carol. Carol, I literally doubt I'd punch you unless you give me a legit reason to. Lori. Like being with 10 feet on you on a bad day, which was like the last few weeks? Carol. Well, okay, maybe Lori would have at least yelled at her point of how Carol showed up just to gloat. Not that she needed to know that. Giving a sigh, Lori thumbed the keys on her phone. It's already bad enough that my brother's afraid of me. Sort of. We haven't spoken to each other in weeks, but he sent me a few texts a few days ago, asking how I was feeling. I felt that he didn't love me anymore, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. It doesn't help that I don't even know anyone else to talk about it. My sisters are on the same boat, so it wouldn't help me in any case. I did see a therapist last week about my own personal issues, but... Lori paused, biting her lower lip as she continued thinking about how far she's fallen into her school and social life. I really just need a shoulder to lean on. I miss Bobby. I miss all my friends. I miss my brother most of all. I just wish things could go back to the way they used to. Even through that line of text was the mix of emoticons. Carol almost felt like she was going to cry, as she felt the pain in each sense of what Lori typed. The bell rang and finally shutting up the teacher and freeing the students from whatever class they had next. Carol slammed her book shut and got out of her seat. Would have made it out the door if she had noticed Lori slouched in her seat, staring at the floor with her eyes noticeably pink. The loud girl then gave a light sniffle as she was lost in her thoughts, then visibly flinched when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning to her left, she looked to see Carol with a sympathetic frown. If you really needed someone to lean on, I'm here for you. Lori gave a low nod. Thank you. Her voice was broken with a whisper, which after Carol helped her out of her seat, before the two blondes left the room. Just passing by the doorframe, Lori's phone buzzed again. Raised a brow. She looked over at Carol. That's not from you, is it? Carol shook her head, looking as just perplexed. Digging her phone out, Lori's heart skipped a beat when she saw the first text from Lynn that was sent to nearly all of her sisters. The tapped message come up on her app on the phone. It found the sporty sister left one hopeful message. He let me sit with him. He actually lets me be near him. To say the girls were anxious to get home was an understatement, but for those who were in middle school age and lower, ran all the way home from their academic prison, while the hence high schoolers were forced to wait out until the bus got to their stop. The teens all but threw their doors open as they bolted out, and Lisa arrived no later than the rest of them. After excusing herself early and calling a cab, Lynn was already drilled for questions by 4 of her sisters on the way home. Knowing that 3 of her older sisters were likely to do the same, immediately told them to shut up and park it and wait, because she'd be damned if she had to repeat the same story 3 times.